Well, hello everybody. Welcome to this session interview with Dr. Harald Köpping. Harald is a future scientist at 2B Ahead. He has expertise spanning space technology, global politics, and holding a PhD in management studies from the University of Liverpool. Harald brings a unique blend of academic rigor and real-world experience in migration management and international relations. And we're really interested to hear from Harald what he thinks about the global carbon reward policy. So thank you, Harald, for coming to this interview, online interview. I hope you find the policy interesting, and I'd just like to ask you some questions.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me, and I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Okay, well, what we're going to try and do today is just get your opinion on the feasibility of the policy, what you like about it or don't like. So I'll just throw some questions at you and see how we go. So first question, do you think the carbon reward policy will address the root cause of the climate crisis?
Well, it's an interesting question I've been spending quite a lot of time thinking about as a futurist, because the climate crisis is one of the dominant issues that we encounter when we do our work as futurists, because it will really shape what our societies will look like over the next hundreds of years, really. And we've been thinking about possible ways to tackle the climate crisis. And one of the main solutions that we encounter is something called a circular economy. So the idea that you basically reuse materials over and over again, and that you reduce the amount of material, of resources that you take out of the environment to the bare minimum, and that you also reduce the waste to the minimum. So eventually you end up in a state where you just reuse resources over and over again. Now, the issue with that is that, first of all, I don't think it's realistic. I don't think it will deliver on its promise. I don't think that we can really have an economy which produces near zero waste and which needs no new resources. Because in the end, a lot of our economy lives off growth, and we still need to have growth in much of the world which is currently underdeveloped, where people still live in poverty. These regions need to experience substantial growth, and I just don't think that the circular economy is realistic, especially if you have people who still live in very poor conditions. The other thing is, of course, a transition period. I mean, how long is it actually going to take until we reach the circular economy? And what about the transition period? What will we do with all the waste that will be produced during that transition period? I think that is also an unanswered question. And so I don't think that the circular economy promise will live up to perhaps the expectations that have been conjured up. And the second solution that we regularly encounter, and this may be surprising because it's not really entered public discourse yet, but I do think it underlines sort of the gravity of the situation, is geoengineering. So the idea that the only way that we can really combat climate change is by tampering with the Earth's atmosphere, and to change the amount of solar radiation that will enter the Earth's atmosphere to reduce the sort of thing that happens after a catastrophic volcanic eruption. So we do that artificially to lower temperatures. Now, the issue with that is, of course, is we don't know what other side effects such radical measures would have on the Earth's systems. And also, there is a potential rebound effect. So if you stop actually employing geoengineering, what would happen to global temperatures? So initially, you might indeed see like cooling down or stabilization, but after you stop applying geoengineering, they would just spike up like instantaneously, essentially. And so it's quite a dangerous policy, which would make us dependent on having geoengineering, which would make us dependent on global consensus as well on geoengineering. What happens if some countries don't want that anymore? So I think also politically, it's quite a risky and dangerous strategy, apart from all the ecological considerations. So the truth is that the global carbon reward is possibly actually the only realistic solution that I've seen to solving the climate crisis, because it actually incentivizes companies, individual governments to be proactive with climate change, to do something about the climate crisis. And it uses the momentum of capitalism to combat the climate crisis. I think that's really its main strength. Yeah.
Yes. So when I was visiting you in Leipzig, I presented a system diagram where I argue we need a civilization or economy divided into two sectors, the goods and services sector and then
Yeah.
a new mitigation sector, which is different to the circular economy, which is more simple. Is that what you were thinking when you were talking about the circular economy?
I think it's a really compelling idea that you have two different economic systems to deal with the climate crisis. To some extent, I think that I don't know whether you've heard of the concept of mimetics, basically, where you try to imitate systems that exist in nature. And in nature, you also have this idea that you have the plant economy, if you want to call it that, right? Or plant ecology, which consumes CO2 and transforms CO2 into oxygen. And then you have animal ecology, which uses that oxygen and transforms it to CO2, and the two benefit from one another. Yeah, and they're mutually dependent on one another in a sense. One is quite inefficient if you look at it from an energy standpoint. I mean, if you anaerobic ecology is nowhere near as efficient as aerobic ecology. So animals are way more efficient than plants in that sense because they're able to extract more energy from the resources that have been provided by the earth. But that's not really a problem because the two work together really well. And I think if we were able to establish a similar system with the economy, where one part of the economy, produces some byproducts which would be harmful to the environment, but then there's this other part of the economy, the regeneration economy, if you will, which deals with that problem in a way that is also economically interesting for those actors that deal with that. I think that could be a system that actually works for the long term. Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's starting to sound a little bit like biomimicry,
Yeah.
but I would argue it's not just mimicking, it's more of an analogy, possibly.
Hmm. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. That's a good point.
yeah. Another question, Harold. Do you think that the global carbon reward policy of providing carbon rewards, which are conditional grants, is a practical idea for economic decarbonisation?
Well, I would say yes, because one of the issues that currently exists with carbon capture is that no one really knows how to finance it. And essentially, the global carbon reward would incentivize companies to employ carbon capture technologies, right?
Mhm.
And it would, but not only that, it would also incentivize um, companies that have the ability to mine fossil fuels not to do so and to leave them in the ground, right? So it would also incentivize that. But that's not sufficient. Obviously, we also need to get some of the CO2 out of the atmosphere. And if you look at the current proposals for how we could still reach even a 2-degree target, they all envision some form of carbon capture. So the question is, of course, how do you pay for it? And so in that sense, these conditional grants that the global carbon reward policy foresees, I think it does precisely that. Because currently there is no real economic incentive for carbon capture. So one needs to be created, and I think the global carbon reward would be exactly that.
Great, great. Thank you. Third question. Do you think that the carbon rewards new mandate for central banks is reasonable given the climate change risk we face?
Well, what kind of policies are reasonable when it comes to addressing the climate crisis? I think, again, if you look at the gravity of the climate crisis, it should become apparent that those demands on the central banks would be quite reasonable. I mean, if you, I don't know if you, of course you have because you wrote you worked with Kim Stanley Robinson on the Ministry for the Future, and so you're familiar with wet bulb temperatures.
Mm.
But what we will likely see over the course of the 21st century is that wet bulb temperatures, which are basically temperatures that you measure when you take a wet towel and you wrap it around the bulb of a thermometer, if those readings exceed 35 degrees, basically the human body would be incapable of surviving under such conditions. And what the current climate models foresee is that over the course of the 21st century, we will likely see such temperatures quite regularly in places, and we will have heat waves which could potentially kill millions. And so in that sense, taking quite drastic action in terms of quantitative easing, which the global carbon reward foresees, I think it is definitely reasonable because it is quite a serious threat to a lot of people on Earth. I don't think climate change, just to make that clear, I don't think climate change is a threat to humanity. I don't think humanity will go extinct from climate change. And I don't think life on Earth will go extinct. And I think that's also quite dangerous to make such statements because I don't think it's helpful. But it is a serious risk, and it's a huge risk to the Earth's biodiversity. It's a huge risk to the Earth's ecosystems, which will become hugely disrupted. And so, yeah, I think it is absolutely reasonable to take those kind of measures. Yeah.
Thank you. Next question. Do you see this policy as having weaknesses or strengths in regards to international politics and the political economy?
Well, this is an interesting one for me because I've studied international relations, and even though my PhD was in management studies, I also, in practice, was also about international relations. And so this is a field that I'm quite familiar with and I've always been thinking about. And I think that in the book, A Ministry for the Future, basically what has to happen is that well bulb temperatures do exceed 35 degrees in India in the course of the 21st century, which causes millions of deaths, which then prompts India to unilaterally begin geoengineering, actually. And so what happens there is a tipping point in the course of climate change, that climate change really manifests itself so radically that it becomes apparent that serious action needs to be taken. And so I do think in order for the type of international coalition to be formed that is required to have the global carbon reward on a global scale, I do think such tipping points need to be reached. And there need to be serious events that take place before that happens. I don't think we're quite there, I've got to be honest with you, because a lot of people still aren't convinced that we need to take serious action about climate change, as you can see in international politics today. But I think once that happens, we will see quite drastic action. And I do think that proposals such as a global carbon reward will become much more plausible. I think that it is quite important to have the world's big economies on board for this. Because obviously there are some risks associated with global carbon reward, and one of them is inflation. And I do think that if only minor economies are involved, then the risk of inflation for those minor economies would be quite substantial, because in the end, we are dealing with quantitative easing, and we are dealing with the central banks creating money out of thin air, if you will. But I do think that if the major economies are involved from the beginning, then it has a far greater chance of success. And I do think that such a scenario is possible, given the tipping points we will experience. As a futurist, we have also thought quite a bit about the future of geopolitics over the course of the next 20 years or so. And one development that we clearly foresee are the establishment of geopolitical blocs. So we can already see right now with the war in Ukraine that essentially we have a proxy war between NATO and Russia. I mean, NATO is not fighting directly as of October 2024, but Russia is, of course, you know, so we are seeing a proxy war there. And the same, it's the same situation in other conflicts around the world. And so I do think that in 20 years or so, when those tipping points have been reached, I do think the global carbon reward is one way that the international community could be reunited under this, if you will. So I think there's actually potential in it to get states to work together, which currently are very far away from cooperation.
Yeah, there's some interesting ideas there. I tend to agree with you. I've also thought that the Overton window for the policy is going to get bigger and bigger in the future, because we'll have more frequent climate emergencies or weather extremes. And you're talking about the emergence of a multipolar world and the kind of splitting of the world into, I guess, blocks of countries. And so, given the climate crisis is a global problem, we can only solve it together as one global community. So it might be the reason for countries to come together on a policy that could guarantee some kind of resolution or solution. Thanks for those comments. Do you think that this policy, the carbon reward, would be attractive to developing nations, given that it will mobilize debt-free finance via the carbon currency and the financial mechanism called carbon quantitative easing?
Well, I think you've already given the answer to some extent there. I mean, given that it does mobilize debt-free finance, I think it would be quite attractive to developing countries. At the same time, I just want to restate the point that I do think it's important that the major economies are on board as well. I don't think it can be achieved if it's only a project that is pushed forward by developing countries. But one point that I wanted to make is that I think it's quite important that the carbon reward policy does not only award companies which already have a substantial amount of money and financial assets. I think it's important that it also rewards private individuals, that it rewards small businesses, also in developing countries. And given that the carbon reward policy substantially lives off the idea that it rewards carbon capture, I just want to underline that sort of this industrial direct air capture is only one way of having carbon capture. There's many other ways of carbon capture which can also be implemented by SMEs and even private individuals. So I'm talking about reforestation, for example, which is another way of carbon capture, or the production of biochar, which would be another way of carbon capture. And this can all be quite easily done by SMEs, including in developing countries. And so if that is all included, I think it represents a huge opportunity for developing countries as well. And apart from all of that, I mean, many developing countries are, of course, in the global south. Yeah. So if you think about the Sahara Desert, for example, or other arid regions of the earth, yeah, they're arid right now, but they have immense potential in terms of solar power and in terms of the energy production of the future. And as a futurist, the energy issue is another issue that we're really interested in. And it is generally also in the age of AI, it is a big question, where are we going to get all that energy from? And we don't think that fusion power will be available in 2045. We don't think that's realistic, that it will be available at scale. And so solar energy is the best bet we've got. And many developing countries really have a great ace under their sleeves, because they will be able to implement solar energy at scale. And so that energy can then be used also for direct air capture projects or carbon capture projects, which is interesting in terms of giving them an incentive to support the global carbon reward.
Great, thank you. You mentioned that if we reward companies that are already wealthy, that's not such a great outcome. In particular, fossil fuel companies.
Yeah.
One feature of the policy is the energy asset exchange, where we'd like to buy out fossil fuel resources and have those energy companies use that money to build renewables, really flipping the coin. But do you see that that could be a moral dilemma if we are transacting so much money with fossil fuel companies?
Well, yes, in some sense, of course. I mean, fossil fuel companies, if you will, are responsible for much of the emissions that have been produced in the 20th and 21st century. I mean, can you really blame them? I'm not sure, because obviously there was demand for fossil fuels. But at the same time, there is a moral dilemma there in terms of paying them to not do something, right? To not extract fossil fuels from the soil. Nevertheless, these companies also have a lot of expertise. They know how to handle grand projects. And if we are going to remove CO2 from the atmosphere at scale, I think that we will need companies that have that kind of know-how. And so in that sense, I think that we should use these companies' competences and abilities and leverage them for good. So that would be that's an interesting idea, I think.
Great. We're coming close to the end of this interview. Second last question. How do you think the carbon reward policy would be implemented in terms of piloting political events worsening climate change? In the UN process, could you see a storyline where this policy comes in through certain steps? we've read the novel The Ministry from the Future. Perhaps you have some thoughts on how it might actually be implemented.
I do think that the novel actually portrays, from my point of view, the most plausible scenario for how the carbon reward policy could actually be implemented. As I've said earlier, I do think it's quite important to have the major economies on board. And I don't think that the major economies, or really anybody, will really wake up to the climate crisis before certain tipping points have been reached. So I think once that happens, I think there will be a lot of proposals floating about for how we could deal with the issue. And I've mentioned some of the proposals at the beginning. So there's geoengineering, there's the idea of a circular economy. There's also the idea of CO2 certificates and how they could be used. And then there will also be the global carbon reward. And from my point of view, the global carbon reward is the most compelling that I've encountered. And so I hope that that's what they'll decide. But ultimately, well, I don't really think it's just wishful thinking. I really don't think that, because it is quite a convincing idea, because again, it uses the momentum of capitalism to fight climate change, which the other policies, I don't think, do to the same extent.
Good to hear. So I have one more question, and it's just an open question. Do you have any additional comments or concerns about the policy that you'd like to share?
Well, I do think that it would be really interesting to explore the concept of CO2 certificates further and compare how CO2 certificates work compared with the global carbon reward. As far as I know, CO2 certificates basically set a price on carbon and on carbon emissions. And then depending on how many carbon emissions you have to pay that price. And you can produce more carbon emissions by buying CO2 certificates. And other actors, which then basically have carbon capture plants, or which have reforestation projects, using those projects, you can basically hand out the CO2 certificates. So in a sense, there's some similarities between the CO2 certificates and a global carbon reward. What my fear is that CO2 certificates can produce a race to the bottom, because basically you could have an actor like the EU, which at least historically has been at the forefront of climate change policies, which is very ambitious in terms of CO2 certificates. Or you could have some other countries which say, well, if you want to produce as much CO2 as you want, just, come to us. And I don't think that under the global carbon reward scheme, that danger really exists, because you still get rewarded by not producing CO2. And you don't really have that in the CO2 certificate system, which also requires a lot of monitoring, which the global carbon reward system doesn't require to the same extent. But I do think it would be quite interesting to delve further into that and to look at that and how those two systems compare. But beyond that, I think it's a very promising proposal.
Oh, terrific. Thanks, Harold. Really appreciate your thoughts and comments. It's been a very interesting interview. Thank you again. And if you would like to come on for another interview in the future as we develop the project, we'd love to have another conversation.
That'd be lovely. Thank you so much, Delton. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.